Chapter 1. The Arrival at Greystone Hollow. It was one of those crisp spring mornings when the scent of daffodils and freshly turned soil lingered in the air, and the birds of Greystone Hollow were in full chorus. The village, snug between rolling hills and bordered by woodlands, had the kind of charm that artists tried to capture and writers longed to describe. Jessica Fletcher, best-selling mystery author and part-time sleuth, had just arrived for a 2-week stay at the cottage of her dear friend, Iris Pembroke. Jessica stepped down from the hired car, clad in a navy raincoat, a leather-bound notebook tucked under her arm. Her eyes swept the street, cobblestones, clipped hedges, the old church spire poking the sky like a pointed hat, and smiled. "Quaint," she murmured, "but deceptively quiet, I imagine." Iris, a sprightly woman in her late 60s with a fondness for wide-brimmed hats and lavender perfume, greeted her with warm hugs and a pot of elderflower tea. "Oh, Jess, you've no idea how much I need your company," Iris said, ushering her in. "Things have been rather odd lately." "Odd how?" Jessica asked, stirring her tea. "It's Reverend Cleves," Iris said, lowering her voice, though the only other occupant was a dozing tabby cat. He claims someone's been tampering with the bell tower. Twice now the bells rung in the dead of night. Once at exactly 3 a.m. and once during a wedding rehearsal. Jessica raised an eyebrow. "Pranks, perhaps?" "I'd have said so, but Reverend Cleves is convinced it's deliberate, and not the mischievous kind. He believes someone's trying to scare him." Jessica had learned long ago that village gossip was often the thread that unraveled something larger. She made a mental note to visit the church. Later that afternoon, Iris led Jessica to the village green, where the annual spring fair preparations were underway. The vicarage stood tall beyond the stalls, its brickwork tinged with moss and history. She met Reverend Cleves, a thin man with a deeply lined face and the perpetual look of someone expecting a thunderclap. "I'm told you've had midnight disturbances," Jessica said gently. The Reverend nodded. "Twice now, without any sign of entry. The bell pulls kept inside the vestry, locked at all times. And yet, perhaps someone has a key?" "Impossible," he said. "Only I and Miss Larch, our church secretary, have keys. And she's as devout as they come." Jessica turned to view the bell tower, its narrow slit windows casting shadows like watchful eyes. "Has anything else gone missing? Or been out of place?" "Not that I've noticed," he replied. "But the timing, always at 3 in the morning, strikes me as deliberate. A warning, perhaps." Jessica knew from experience that such events rarely happened in isolation. She decided a walk around the church grounds might offer more than conversation. As she walked the gravel path circling the nave, a figure emerged from behind the lich gate. It was Harold Dunning, the village solicitor, impeccably dressed and perpetually unimpressed. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said with a tight smile. "We've heard of your interest in puzzles." Jessica returned the smile. "And I've heard solicitors never walk without purpose." Harold chuckled, though without warmth. "Perhaps I was checking the integrity of the church lease. This tower nonsense has everyone rattled." Jessica didn't miss the deflection. "And are you rattled, Mr. Dunning?" "Not in the least. I deal in facts, not folklore." Yet as he left, she noted his hand trembled slightly. Interesting. That evening, as the village prepared for the fair's opening ceremony, news spread like fire. Miss Larch, the church secretary, had taken ill and was found collapsed beside the church ledger. No sign of forced entry, no valuables missing, but beside her lay a torn scrap of parchment with a single word: "Forgive." Jessica stood quietly, absorbing every detail, every hushed whisper. The villagers speculated heart attack, exhaustion, or perhaps something more sinister. As the clock struck 10, the bell tolled once. Only once. A hush fell over the village square. "That's not right," Reverend Cleves murmured. "It was not I who rang it." Jessica looked up at the dark tower, its silhouette framed against the moonlight. She tightened her coat and turned to Iris. "It seems, my dear, that someone wants to make their presence very clearly known, and I dare say it's not just for dramatic effect." The mystery had begun. Chapter 2. Whispers and Weeds. The following morning in Greystone Hollow dawned hazy, with mist curling along the cobbles like a living thing. Jessica stood at Iris's kitchen window, her tea growing cold in her hands. Across the lane, a figure in a maroon shawl moved through the churchyard, pruning shears flashing silver in the low light. "That's Mrs. Featherstone," Iris said, placing a plate of toast beside her. "A widow. Keeps the vicar's garden and tends the graves, whether anyone asks her to or not." "She was there yesterday, after the incident?" "Oh yes, she said the weeds don't wait for drama." Jessica wrapped her scarf and decided to pay the woman a visit. She found Mrs. Featherstone kneeling by a leaning headstone, her hands in the soil and her expression unreadable. "Good morning," Jessica said gently. "Do you mind a word?" "Mind? Certainly not," the widow said, brushing the dirt from her skirt. "You're the American lady, the writer?" Jessica smiled. "I suppose that's true, though lately I've found life provides more mysteries than fiction does." Mrs. Featherstone chuckled darkly. "You won't find fiction in that church, Mrs. Fletcher. Only secrets too old to rot, and truths buried deeper than these bones." "That's quite poetic." "It's quite real," the widow replied. "That bell, it should never have rung. Not like that." Jessica crouched nearby. "You believe there's a reason?" "I do, and not a godly one." Before Jessica could probe further, footsteps crunched along the path. Reverend Cleves approached, pale and uneasy. "Jessica, I must show you something." They entered the vestry through the side door. He unlocked a small iron cabinet with trembling fingers and removed a bound volume, the church's visitor register. "Look at yesterday's entries," he said. Jessica scanned the names. Most were local. One, however, stood out. "Thomas Warburton, March 17th, 3:05 p.m. "Does that name mean anything?" she asked. Reverend Cleves nodded gravely. "He's the son of Gregory Warburton, the clockmaker." Jessica remembered the story vaguely. Gregory Warburton had lived on the edge of the village, a brilliant but troubled man. His wife had died under unclear circumstances, and the man had taken to wandering the woods, rambling about divine punishment and hollow time. He'd passed away 5 years ago, some said peacefully, others not. "His son never came to the funeral," the Reverend continued. "He left Greystone Hollow years before. Now he appears, signs the ledger, and hours later—" "The bell tolls," Jessica finished. They were interrupted by a clatter in the nave. A young woman burst through the rear doors, breathless. She wore denim overalls and carried a folder under her arm. Sorry, I'm Sophie Denton. I volunteer here sometimes. I think I found something odd in the archives room." Jessica followed Sophie down the stone passage behind the altar, past boxes of hymnals and flower vases. The room at the end was small and musty, shelves stacked with brittle parish records. "I was cataloguing old bell maintenance reports," Sophie said, flipping open the folder. "There's one here from 20 years ago, signed by G. Warburton." She tapped the yellowed page with a bitten fingernail. He noted that the bell's counterweight had been modified. He said the bell could toll with no human effort. Jessica's eyes narrowed. "Could it be triggered remotely?" "Not exactly, but..." If someone knew how the mechanism worked, they might recreate it, set it in motion at will. "And Miss Larch?" Jessica asked. "Did she ever mention anything unusual before her collapse?" Sophie hesitated. "She'd been reviewing the same files. She said she found an inconsistency, but I never saw what she meant." Jessica examined the old report again. Something about the ink seemed darker than the others. Newer? She took a closer look. "This signature," she said slowly, "was added later." Sophie blinked. "What does that mean?" "It might mean someone wants us to believe the bell can ring on its own, but someone went to a great deal of trouble to create that impression. That's no ghost story, Miss Denton. That's misdirection." As they exited the church, the sun began to pierce through the mist, casting long shadows across the gravestones. Jessica spotted Mrs. Featherstone once again, this time not alone. A tall man in a grey coat was speaking to her. When he turned, Jessica caught a glimpse of his profile. Sharp nose, sandy hair, a furrowed brow. Iris appeared beside her. "That's him. That's Thomas Warburton." Jessica watched closely. Thomas Warburton caught her eye, hesitated, then tipped his head politely before turning on his heel and vanishing down the path behind the hedge. Jessica stood in place, thoughtful. "I believe the bell wasn't the first thing meant to ring. It may only be the beginning." And with that, the fog of suspicion began to lift, but not enough to see clearly. Not yet. Chapter 3. The Clockmaker's Cottage. The wind had picked up by the time Jessica reached the outskirts of Greystone Hollow that afternoon. The narrow road to Bellman's Ridge was flanked by a tangle of hawthorn hedges, and overhead, crows cawed lazily. According to Iris, the Warburton cottage hadn't been lived in since old Gregory's death, though villagers claimed they'd seen a lantern flickering behind its windows more than once this week. Jessica's boots crunched over gravel as she approached the gate. It hung crookedly, a faint squeal rising as she pushed it open. The cottage itself stood solemn behind a curtain of ivy, with its once white paint peeling and shutters slightly ajar. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again, and just as she turned to leave, the door opened a fraction. A pale eye appeared through the crack, then the door opened fully to reveal Thomas Warburton. He looked older than his 30-odd years, tired, dishevelled, but not entirely unkind. "You're Mrs. Fletcher," Jessica nodded. "May I have a word?" Thomas hesitated. "Come in then, but mind the step. The floor's seen better years." The sitting room was dim and smelled of damp paper and oil. Clocks, dozens of them, lined every surface. Some ticked in rhythm, some sat silent, and a few chimed sporadically as though unsure of the hour. Jessica looked around. "Your father's work." Thomas nodded. "And his burden. He couldn't let them be quiet. Said silence was unnatural." "I understand you visited the church yesterday." Thomas tensed. "I signed the register. I hadn't planned to stay long." "Then why return now?" He turned to face her, jaw tight. "To settle something. This house is still in my name. The past doesn't just dissolve, Mrs. Fletcher. Sometimes it waits." Jessica's eyes drifted to a framed photograph on the mantel. A woman in a long coat, standing beside a young boy. "Your mother?" He didn't respond. Instead, he moved toward a chest under the stairs and opened it. Inside lay a brass pendulum and a folder marked Tower Mechanisms, 1987. He offered her the folder. "My father kept meticulous notes. He believed someone tampered with the bell 20 years ago, altered the weight structure. He always said the tower held a secret, but no one listened." Jessica opened the folder. The first few pages were filled with diagrams of the bell's internal workings, gears, counterweights, release mechanisms. But what caught her attention was a letter tucked into the back. It was addressed to Reverend H. Cleves, dated 2005. I have reason to believe the bell was used once to signal more than worship. I beg you to examine the ledger from 1987. The answer lies beneath the list of donors. There was no signature. Jessica looked up. Do you know what this is referring to? Thomas shook his head. No one in the village speaks of 1987. Something happened that year. Something buried. She tucked the letter into her notebook. Thank you, Mr. Warburton. You've been very helpful. Outside, the wind had grown stronger. Jessica pulled her coat tighter as she made her way back into the village. On the way, she stopped at the vicarage, where Sophie Denton was sorting hymnals in the rear hall. Do we have the 1987 donation ledger? Jessica asked. Sophie frowned. We should. I'll check the back office. 10 minutes later, they were bent over the dusty book in the vestry. Jessica flipped to the donor list. Names were neatly recorded, local families, small businesses, even a few anonymous contributions. But something wasn't right. She ran her fingers under the page's edge and found it slightly thicker than the rest. Peeling gently, she uncovered a second sheet glued underneath. The hidden page contained a list of initials and amounts, identical donations listed with an X beside each one. But one name was underlined twice, G. Warburton, £150, X. Jessica's brow furrowed. This looks more like a ledger of dues or hush money. Sophie covered her mouth. That's not church record-keeping. That's accounting for something secret. Jessica nodded. And that secret didn't die with Gregory Warburton. Someone wants to keep it hidden even now. As they prepared to reseal the page, the church door creaked open. Jessica turned, expecting the Reverend, but it was Iris, breathless and flushed. Jess, come quickly. They've found something in the bell tower. Jessica and Sophie followed Iris back through the nave, up the spiral stone staircase that coiled to the belfry. The air grew colder as they climbed. At the top, Reverend Cleves stood pale-faced beside a constable, while a man in overalls, Peter Miles, the village handyman, held up a rusted spanner. In the gap behind the wall, Peter said, there's a compartment, been sealed for years. The constable opened the small door with a crowbar. Inside lay a velvet pouch, and inside the pouch, a silver cross, stained dark at the edge. Jessica leaned closer. That's blood. Everyone turned to stare at her. No one noticed that before? The constable asked. Peter swallowed. That wasn't here a week ago. I'm sure of it. Jessica narrowed her eyes at the pouch. A new clue, planted in an old hiding place. Whoever was behind this wasn't just trying to rattle the village. They were unearthing something, piece by piece. Chapter 4. Tea with the Undertaker. It was a grey and unsettled afternoon when Jessica strolled past the row of Georgian cottages lining Market Lane. The village green, usually lively with dogs and chatter, lay quiet beneath a leaden sky. Jessica had learned long ago that silence in a small village often meant everyone was speaking, just not aloud. Word of the hidden silver cross and the blood-stained pouch had travelled faster than the baker's morning rolls. Everyone had a theory, a ritual, a warning, a revenge, long delayed. Jessica had heard snippets as she passed the grocer's. Witchcraft, said Mrs. Tilling. Smugglers, insisted young Max Jenkins. Iris, for her part, had simply offered, or someone with an old grudge and a newer imagination. Jessica's destination, however, was the chapel by the river, specifically the small, ivy-clad outbuilding at its rear, the office of Lionel Price, Greystone Hollow's solitary and solemn undertaker. He greeted her at the door with a sombre nod. Mrs. Fletcher, I wondered when you'd come. Jessica arched a brow. You expected me? You've been asking the right questions, I hear. And when old things begin to stir, it's often the ones who deal with the dead who notice first. She followed him into a modest room lined with ledgers, brass fittings and shelves of florid condolence cards. A grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner. I believe you conducted Gregory Warburton's burial, she asked. I did. Quiet affair. Closed casket. No family in attendance. Jessica sat opposite him. Was there anything unusual? Lionel paused. The vicar asked that I omit something from the record. He said it would save the village embarrassment. Jessica leaned forward. Omit what exactly? He opened a side drawer and pulled out a duplicate death certificate. A thick black line had been drawn through the word natural. It was poison, Lionel said. Hemlock found traces in his system, but Cleves insisted Gregory had suffered long enough, said some stories were better left untold. Jessica sat back, thoughtful. And the cause of death was altered? Officially, yes. Privately, I kept this. She turned the certificate in her hands. Do you know why the Reverend would protect that secret? Maybe guilt or fear, or both. Jessica thanked Lionel and stepped outside. Rain had begun to fall lightly, dappling the pavement and soaking the edges of her coat. As she turned to walk back to the cottage, she spotted a man standing across the green, under the stone arch of the library portico. He was tall and wore a waxed jacket, his face obscured by the brim of a cap. When she glanced again, he was gone. That evening, Jessica and Iris sat near the fire, tea in hand. I never liked the idea of Gregory Warburton dying peacefully, Iris confessed. The man was a wreck those last few years, paranoid, kept muttering about the tolling of debts. Jessica turned the phrase over in her mind. Debts? There was talk once. A fund collected to restore the tower roof. It disappeared. Some said Warburton had mismanaged it. And who handled the accounts? Miss Larch. And Mr. Dunning helped review the books, if I recall. Jessica considered that. And now Miss Larch is unconscious and Dunning avoids every question. At that moment, the cottage telephone rang. Iris answered. Oh, yes, I see. Thank you, Constable. She hung up and turned to Jessica, her voice hushed. Someone's broken into the vicarage. Within the hour, Jessica stood inside Reverend Cleves's private study, the window panes smashed inward. Papers were strewn across the desk, drawers pulled open. A picture frame lay shattered on the floor, its contents missing. What was taken? Jessica asked. The Reverend stood pale and shaken. A photograph. From the Bell Restoration Committee in '87, who was in it? Gregory Warburton, Miss Larch, myself, and Harold Dunning. Jessica's mind raced. Why take just that? I don't know, he said faintly. But it's not the only thing. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded sheet of music paper. Scribbled in red ink across the lines was a phrase. The bell tolls twice. The second time is for you. Jessica frowned. A threat. Not subtle. Sophie Denton entered from the hallway, holding a soggy parcel wrapped in brown paper. Found this at the garden gate. Inside was an old, water-damaged ledger marked G.H. Roof Fund, 1987. Jessica opened it. The balance was empty. The pieces were falling into place, but not yet in order. Someone was resurrecting the past, and the sound of that tolling bell was no longer just symbolic. It was counting down. Chapter 5. A visitor in the night. The rain had not let up by morning. Thin streams trickled along the cobbles and pooled in the dips outside the greengrocer's. Jessica Fletcher sat at Iris Pembroke's kitchen table with a half-eaten crumpet, eyes fixed on the faint outlines of footprints trailing up the garden path, booted, uneven, and certainly not Iris's. "They weren't there at midnight," Iris said, peering over her glasses. Jessica stood, clutching her coat. "Someone came calling in the early hours, likely didn't knock." The two women stepped outside beneath the porch awning, Jessica kneeling near the prints. They led from the hedgerow at the rear, past the tool shed, and stopped abruptly beneath the parlour window. "There's no sign of forced entry," Jessica murmured, "but someone was watching. I'd wager they hoped to overhear something." They returned inside. The air was thick with unease. Iris's phone had rung just after dawn, a call from Dr. Hemmings at the local infirmary. Miss Larch had stirred briefly in her hospital bed and murmured something. Only one word: ledger. Now Jessica made her way toward the infirmary, her mind a tangle of questions. Who had broken into the vicarage? Who had sent the ominous music note? And why now, decades after the events of 1987, was someone willing to frighten or harm anyone connected to that year? The infirmary sat low behind an iron gate, with rose bushes blooming defiantly in the damp. Inside, the matron greeted Jessica and led her down a quiet corridor. Miss Larch lay in a private room, pale against her pillows but awake, blinking slowly. Jessica approached with gentle calm. "Miss Larch, it's Jessica Fletcher." The woman's eyes fluttered, then steadied. She managed a small nod. "You mentioned the ledger," Jessica said softly. "Can you tell me what you found?" Miss Larch's lips moved, barely audible. Jessica leaned closer. "It wasn't Gregory," she breathed. "Not him. It was... I saw..." Her voice caught in her throat, and the monitor beeped. A nurse quickly ushered Jessica back. "She needs rest now." Jessica left the infirmary more certain than ever. Someone had tried to silence Miss Larch, and she had only just escaped death. That afternoon, Jessica visited the village library, where the librarian, Mr. Penrose, agreed to let her examine the archives. "You're looking into the tower business, aren't you?" he asked, as he opened the locked case of parish newsletters. "Half the village is." "I'm hoping the other half still knows how to keep quiet," Jessica said dryly. The 1987 newsletters revealed little, except for one oddity. An article about the tower repairs had been retracted in the following issue. The reason given: details under review. But in the margin of the first article, someone had scribbled a name in pencil. "Monsieur Denholm." Jessica tapped her chin. That name hadn't come up before. She turned to Penrose. Who was Monsieur Denholm? He thought a moment. "Michael Denholm. He was a school teacher here, volunteered with the church council. Bit of a firebrand, always poking at things best left alone. Left town suddenly, just after that roof fund scandal broke." "Where did he go?" "Scotland, I think. Or so we were told." Jessica thanked him and headed straight to the post office. The clerk, a chatty woman named Grace, confirmed a forwarding address had once been arranged for a Michael Denholm, but it had expired long ago. Jessica made a copy of the address and stepped out into the soft drizzle, where she nearly bumped into Peter Miles, the handyman who'd discovered the cross in the tower. "Sorry, Mrs. Fletcher," he exclaimed, tipping his cap. "Didn't mean to startle you." "Not at all. Peter, may I ask, when you found the cross, were there signs that the hiding place had been tampered with recently?" He nodded. "Fresh dust along the stone edge, like someone had pulled the panel away and replaced it." "But poorly." Jessica smiled politely. "And who else knew that panel existed?" "No one, far as I know. My da told me about it when I was a boy. He helped build the new frame when the bell cracked. Said every tower hides a story." Jessica's eyes lit. "That it does, Peter." That evening, Iris set down a parcel, wrapped in brown paper. "This was dropped off with no note," she said. "Left outside your room." Jessica unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a handbell, antique, polished. A faded tag hung from the handle, tied with red thread. It read, "One toll remains." Jessica stared at the bell, her breath shallow. Not a threat this time, a countdown. Chapter 6. Secrets Beneath the Stone. It was still dark when Jessica rose. A breeze rattled the shutters of Iris's guest room, and somewhere in the distance a fox barked. Jessica sat at the edge of the bed, staring at the antique handbell on the writing desk. Its presence unsettled her, not just the implied warning, but the precision. Whoever had left it knew where she slept. By 8 o'clock the village was stirring. At the bakery the usual clatter of trays and chatter was muted. People glanced over shoulders, eyes lingered a bit too long. The bell had always meant safety here, weddings, harvests, remembrance. Now it had become a symbol of dread. Jessica made her way to the churchyard. Reverend Cleves was already there, shoulders hunched as he trimmed the rose bushes by the vestry. He looked up as she approached. "I'm afraid we've lost the village," he said quietly. Everyone's looking over their shoulder. "Fear makes people notice things they usually ignore," Jessica replied. "And people ignore a great deal when secrets are convenient." Cleves sighed. "I've remembered something I had buried." Jessica waited. In 1987, the bell tower repairs were delayed by several weeks. Gregory Warburton had insisted on some modification, I can't recall what, only that it involved something beneath the structure. One morning, he came to me looking like he'd seen a ghost. He never said what he found. "And you didn't ask?" Jessica said gently. "I didn't need to." He handed me a sealed envelope and said, "If anyone ever goes digging again, tell them I warned you." "Where is it?" "I buried it," Cleves said, voice strained. "Behind the pulpit. I thought it was just grief talking." "May I see it?" The Reverend led her into the dim church. He retrieved a small spade from the vestry and knelt at the base of the pulpit platform. 10 minutes of careful digging revealed a rusted tin box, sealed with string and wax. Jessica opened it with care. Inside was a folded note in Gregory Warburton's spidery handwriting and a faded photograph. She read the note aloud. Under the floor by the bell rope, the stone marked with a triangle. "It was never meant to be disturbed. I covered it, but the guilt still tolls. If it's opened again, someone will pay." Beneath the note, the photograph showed a group of villagers, 8 of them. Jessica recognized Reverend Cleves, Miss Larch, Harold Dunning, and a much younger Gregory. But it was the unfamiliar face that drew her attention. A young man standing apart from the others, arms folded and unsmiling. His name was scrawled on the back in faded ink, Michael Denholm. Jessica pocketed the letter and photo. "I think it's time we looked under that stone." The Reverend hesitated. "You believe there's something there still?" "I believe someone else does." That afternoon, Jessica returned to the church, this time with Peter Miles and Sophie Denton in tow. The nave was empty, the air heavy with expectation. Jessica pointed to the stone slab beside the bell rope, weathered and slightly raised at one corner. Peter knelt and ran his hand along the edges. "This one's been pried loose recently." Sophie handed him a chisel, and with a careful motion he lifted the stone. Beneath it was a shallow cavity. Inside lay a velvet-lined box, and within the box, a small, decayed, leather-bound book. Jessica opened it slowly. The first page bore a simple title, etched in ink, faded brown with age, The Tolling Book. The entries inside were chilling. Not religious notes, not repair logs, names, just names. Each one followed by a date, and in some the word cleared. Others had a different mark, Ode. I don't understand, Sophie whispered. It's a ledger, Jessica said, not of donations, but of debts. Debts kept quiet. The church tower was the hiding place. Reverend Cleves swallowed. And the bell? A signal? Jessica nodded. Whoever rang it may have been warning someone, or reminding them. Peter, pale, stepped back. This is dangerous stuff. Jessica rose slowly. And someone wants it kept hidden. That night, as Jessica sat once again by the fire at Iris's, flipping through the tolling book page by page, she stopped short. The last name. Written in newer ink, clear and deliberate, J. Fletcher. Below it, the word next. Iris gasped as she read it over her shoulder. They've marked you, Jess. Jessica calmly closed the book. Then we know we're close. Chapter 7. Ashes and Answers. The following morning, the sky over Greystone Hollow was still and sullen, the rain clouds having drifted eastward, leaving behind a damp hush. Jessica Fletcher stood beside the old stone lich gate at the church entrance, tolling book clutched firmly under her coat. She had spent most of the night awake, studying the cryptic entries and revisiting every detail since her arrival. Someone had added her name to that ledger, someone with access, knowledge and motive. She had narrowed it to 3 suspects: Harold Dunning, the evasive solicitor who handled church funds; Thomas Warburton, son of the man who discovered the original secret; and Sophie Denton, whose eagerness to help often placed her close to every new clue. She needed answers, but first she needed to draw the spider out of the web. Her opportunity came sooner than expected. At midday, Reverend Cleves announced a sudden bell tower inspection, citing structural concerns. Jessica knew it was a ruse, her suggestion, in fact, designed to unsettle whoever had the most to hide. By early afternoon, the villagers had gathered in scattered knots around the church green. Jessica, dressed modestly in her navy raincoat and sensible shoes, moved quietly among them. She found Sophie pacing beside the herb garden. "You look uneasy," Jessica said gently. "I am," Sophie replied. "Ever since that book was found, I feel like we've crossed a line." Jessica tilted her head. "Or uncovered one." Sophie looked at her. "You don't think I had anything to do with it?" Jessica met her gaze. "I think you've been honest, but I also think you know something you haven't said yet." Sophie looked away, jaw tense. "You're not wrong." "I was in the tower 3 nights ago." Jessica's eyes narrowed. "I followed Thomas Warburton," Sophie admitted. "He was acting strange. I saw him go in, so I hid and waited. He took something out from under the bell rope, something wrapped in velvet. He looked at it, said nothing, and left it there." "You're certain it was Thomas?" "Yes." Jessica squeezed her arm. "Thank you for telling me." She left Sophie and crossed the green to the law office of Harold Dunning. The man looked startled when she appeared in his doorway. "Mrs. Fletcher, I'm quite busy." "So was Miss Larch," Jessica said pointedly, until someone silenced her. Dunning's nostrils flared. "Are you accusing me?" "I'm suggesting you've been very quiet about the 1987 roof fund, and the false donations, and the ghost entry in the ledger." Dunning's eyes flickered. "I was told to sign off. I didn't ask questions." "By whom?" He paused. "Gregory Warburton." Jessica stepped closer. "Then why is it your name that appears in the final pages of the tolling book? Your name." "Your handwriting," Dunning paled. "You found the book?" "I did." And before he could answer, the church bell rang. Once. Then again. The crowd outside froze. A third toll echoed through the square. Jessica turned and ran. Up the tower staircase she climbed, each stone step slick with damp. At the top, the hatch to the belfry was ajar. She pushed it open. There, Standing by the bell with a long-handled hook was Thomas Warburton. "Step away from the rope, Thomas." He turned slowly. In one hand was the velvet pouch. His expression was unreadable. "You were never meant to see this, Mrs. Fletcher." "You've gone to great lengths," Jessica said, voice steady. "Faked signatures, buried evidence, even added my name to that ledger." Thomas gave a bitter smile. "Because I needed you involved. You were the only one who could make them listen. The village, I mean." "To what exactly?" He raised the pouch. "My father discovered the truth, that the tower was used by the church council to extort villagers, donations in exchange for silence. He threatened to expose it, and then he died." "By poison." "Yes," Thomas said flatly. "The Reverend covered it up. Dunning buried the financial records, and Miss Larch, she kept the tolling book locked away until she couldn't anymore." "And the cross in the compartment?" "My father's. A symbol. He left it behind when he found what the tower truly stood for." Jessica took a step closer. "Why now?" "Because they thought the past would stay buried. They were wrong." He dropped the pouch. It hit the wooden floor with a thud. "I didn't hurt Miss Larch, but I wanted them afraid. I wanted the bells to haunt them, the way their secrets haunted my father." Jessica sighed. "You've made your point, but the truth doesn't need theatre, it needs proof." Thomas knelt and opened the pouch. Inside was a bundle of papers, original documents from the roof fund, names, dates, false signatures, enough to unravel the entire affair. He handed them to Jessica. "I trust you more than I trust anyone here." Below, the church square was still. The people had gathered beneath the bell tower, looking up. Jessica stood by the railing, the pouch in her hands. "Let the truth ring louder than the bell," she murmured. Chapter 8. The Last Toll. The bell had not rung since that evening. Its silence now echoed louder than any chime it had tolled. By the following morning, the storm that had hovered for days finally broke. Sunshine filtered over Greystone Hollow like a long-delayed blessing. Church steeples gleamed damply, and the village square bustled once more, though cautiously, like people recovering from a collective fever. Jessica sat at Iris's garden table, sorting through the stack of documents Thomas Warburton had entrusted to her. They were exacting in detail: donation records, meeting minutes, false accounts bearing familiar names, even a series of unsigned letters between the council members in 1987. They proved one thing beyond doubt: the restoration fund had been embezzled, and those who'd known, including Reverend Cleves and Solicitor Harold Dunning, had conspired to keep it quiet. A soft knock sounded at the back gate. It was Sophie Denton, clutching a cloth-covered package and a nervous smile. "I thought you might want this," she said. "It's the original bell rope from the restoration. I found it in the archive loft, tucked inside a box of harvest banners, with a note." Jessica unfolded the yellowing paper tucked beneath the rope. "Let this remain untouched." It pulled more than a bell. "GW," Jessica exhaled slowly. "Your instincts were right, Sophie. You were close to the truth all along." Sophie hesitated. "And Thomas?" "He's not a criminal," Jessica said, "but he walked a dangerous line, and someone else crossed it." That someone, Jessica now believed, was Harold Dunning. She found him that afternoon in his office, calmly burning papers in his hearth. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said coolly, "I expect you're here to tell me the world knows what I did." "No, Mr. Dunning," Jessica said, stepping forward. "I'm here to ask you why." His facade cracked just slightly. "Because Greystone Hollow needed its secrets buried, and people like Gregory Warburton couldn't leave them alone. You falsified accounts, silenced Miss Larch." He raised an eyebrow. "I didn't touch her, but I did warn her she wouldn't listen." And you added my name to the tolling book. He shrugged. A gentle reminder that poking into old stones may make them fall. Jessica's expression did not waver. And the poison? Never proven, he said flatly. And now a convenient heart condition has removed Miss Larch from the picture. Gregory's long dead. The Reverend is broken. Jessica studied him. It was never about money, was it? No, Dunning said quietly. It was about keeping the peace, and Greystone's peace is built on silence. Jessica shook her head. Not anymore. Later that week, she met with the village constable, handing over every document, photograph and letter. She explained, clearly and carefully, how the threads wove together, how Harold Dunning orchestrated a decades-long cover-up, how Thomas Warburton had tried to expose it, and how a silver cross and a bell had brought everything crashing down. Reverend Cleves resigned that Sunday. He gave no sermon. Instead, he lit a single candle beneath the bell tower and left a sealed envelope with Jessica. It contained a confession dated a month after Gregory Warburton's death, expressing regret for altering the death certificate and failing to speak out when it mattered most. I let fear guide me, he had written. I hope truth finds its voice, even if I did not. The village would heal in time. Scandals fade, but so do good people if no one remembers why they matter. Jessica packed her bag a week later. At the train station, Iris embraced her tightly. You've given this place a reckoning, Jess. I only turned on the light, Jessica replied. The truth was already there, just waiting for someone to notice. As the train pulled away, she looked back at the spire of St. Edmund's. The bell tower stood tall, silent, and free at last of secrets,